Hello and welcome to this evening's book event co-sponsored by the Mandell JCC Jewish Book Festival and Voices of Hope. My name is Pat Kazakoff. I'm your moderator for the evening, and I'm a former chairman of the Jewish Book Festival at the Mandell JCC. Tonight's program will feature Jai Chakarbarti, author of the play at the End of the World, and Adam Langer, author of Cyclorama. Now, a little bit of business before we start. For all our friends at home, there's going to be a Q&A at the end of our moderated discussion. So please feel free to write your questions as we speak, and we'll try to get through all of them as much as we can at the end of the talk. So hello, Jai. Hello, Adam. Welcome.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Here.
So now a little bit about our guests. I'm going to start with Jai. Jai Chakarbarti is the author of the novel A Play at the End of the World, published by Knopf in 2021. It won the National Jewish Book Award for Debut Fiction, 2021. It was long listed for the Penn Faulkner Award, and it was a fall 2021 Oprah magazine pick. His forthcoming story collection, also from Knopf, A Small Sacrifice for Enormous Happiness, will come out in February 2023, which is just around the corner. His short fiction has appeared in numerous anthologies, and his nonfiction has been widely published. Born in Kolkata, India, he now resides in New York with his family. Welcome, Jai.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Good. And now our next guest is Adam Langer. He's a journalist, editor, playwright, and the author of a memoir and 5 novels, including The Washington Story, Ellington Boulevard, The Thieves of Manhattan, The Salinger Contract, and his international best-selling novel, Crossing California, which happened to be translated into German, Italian, Dutch, Finnish, and Spanish. Also named Best Debut Novel 2004 by Amazon.com. He's worked as a freelance editor, working side by side with Academy Award winners Eli Wallach and Sidney Poitier. He's the executive director of The Forward. He lives in Manhattan with his wife and daughter. Welcome, Adam.
We're forgetting my other daughter. I think that's an old bio. So there are 2 kids here, so I just don't want them to feel forgotten.
No, I'm so happy that you
for,
mentioned that. You know, that you're right. I got this from, I think, a 2005 resume. So thank you for correcting. So I want to tell you, I feel that I'm surrounded by a lot of gray matter. You know, like I just have a lot of gray matter around me. So I thought I'd just mention that. So I'm very, very happy to be here with both of you. And it's really a big honor. So I'm happy is good. Happy is good. Okay, let's start. So the mood and the cadence of your language, the characters are both completely different in both books. But I see some parallels. In fact, when I first started reading your books, people told me that this was a book about a play. And indeed, not so much. However, both books start with the convention of a play. And in fact, Jai, your book starts in 1942 with a play written by Rabindranath. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. Rabindranath Tagore, who is the Nobel laureate of India. And this play found its way, translated originally by W.B. Yeats and eventually in Polish in an orphanage in Warsaw, 1942. How does that happen? Talk about that.
Sure. I think it's an extraordinary historical correspondence. And I will talk about it in terms of how I first came to learn about that story, which is when my partner, the poet Alana Bell, and I were living in Jerusalem, and we visited Yad Vashem.
Can I ask, well, you know what, you just remind, why were you in Jerusalem? Why were you in Israel?
Sure. So my partner, as I mentioned, is a poet, and she'd gotten a travel grant to work on her first collection of poems. And it was an opportunity for us to be together. And, she's also the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. So it was an opportunity to learn about that history. Her mother was born in Israel. So it was a chance to connect back to the Holy Land in many dimensions. So we were living there together, and on our last day in Jerusalem, we visited Yad Vashem, and it was there in an exhibit called Art in the Ghettos that I learned how Janusz Korczak, who was born Henrik Goldschmidt, had chosen to stage a Bengali play in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942. And so this play is about a young child by the name of Amal who's quarantined, who has some sort of mysterious illness. And through the convention or the artifice of this play, Dr. Korczak was able to explore a set of themes with his children and was able to help them understand, conceptualize, and prepare for what was to come. And so this is July of 1942 when he decides to stage the play at his orphanage. It's weeks before the deportations to Treblinka.
Right. I mean, this is historically correct. You didn't make that story up. This is really what happened.
All of that is in the historical record, and the way it connects to me personally, beyond the fact that this was a Bengali play by Rabindranath Tagore, and Tagore, of course, was the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. So growing up in India, we would memorize his poems, we would read his short stories and plays. But this play in particular, which in Bengali is called Dakkor and translated in English as the post office, it was a play that I had a small part in when I was a child living in India, going to school. And so it was, for me, on that day in Yad Vashem, a couple of extraordinary confluences. One, of course, this larger story of how Janusz Korczak chose to turn to art in a time of crisis to support his children. And for me, more personally, it was how this play had a part in my own childhood when I was in Calcutta. So in that moment, it brought those two strands together.
And I'm going to bring another strand together. I happen to speak Polish. That's my maternal language. So I related very strongly to this. Let's move on to Adam. Now, Adam, your book also starts with an audition for a play, and the play that you chose was A Diary of Anne Frank, which had been produced on Broadway in 1955. So it's well known by every American audience. And you used your play more as a vehicle to introduce the characters. So completely different concept, but starting with a play also.
At the same time, I was interested in what Jai was just saying about this play being performed in the Warsaw Ghetto in July 1942. My play is historical in that it takes place in both the 1980s and the present day. But in fact, at the exact time that you're talking about, Jai, Anne Frank got her diary in June 1942, and her family went into hiding in July 1942. So we're talking, actually, in some way, the background for each story is the exact same period in time. So once we were preparing this event, I was saying that often authors get paired with other authors and there's not much affinity, there's not much relationship, but this was a situation where there are definite parallels and the pairing makes a lot of sense. So it's very cool to be on the panel with you. Mm-hmm. And I didn't even notice that there was that other resonance until you just mentioned that. My novel, not a play, begins in 1982, but it's very much a novel about how we got to our present political moment, or at least the political moment we were having maybe a few years ago, and perhaps the political moment they're having now in Brazil. But I wanted to tell a story about how we got to 2016. And the way I got into that was to tell about a play that took place among high school kids in 1982. It follows the trajectories of 10 kids who get together to perform in a show in suburban Chicago in 1982 of The Diary of Anne Frank. And it follows them both it turns out to be a fairly traumatic experience for them. And it follows each of the characters from 1982, and then it kind of slaps forward into 2016 to see the effect of playing in this play and how it affected their lives as adults 35 years later.
Yeah, I have an affinity with that too, because I was one of those child actors. I didn't do The Diary of Anne Frank, but I could see the way you did it was quite interesting, that you had each character in the play as a person who is an actor, and you had the personalities come out through that. And that was very interesting to me, how you teamed everybody up.
Right. And that was one of the kind of exciting things, but also the challenging things, because as a writer, in some way, at least in this novel, I had to be a casting director as well. I kind of had to go through a whole slew of characters in my mind and almost audition them to figure out who would be playing which role, who would be best suited to play the role of Anne Frank, who would be the best suited to play her father. And then once I had done that, to see what sort of effect it would have on them to play these roles, and what sort of effect it would have many years later to see who they had become and whether or not the play had anything to do with that.
Well, as an aside, there's a lot of people in our audience who have the experience of being in plays. And right at the beginning, you have that scene where Declan, he auditions for the play, and he's sure that he's going to get the part. He's sure that he's going to get the part. And you go into him, and there's no actor who hasn't had that sort of feeling. I mean, Chorus Line talks about it. God, I hope I get it. God, I hope I get it. And I found that very, very interesting. Your first scene.
Yeah, I mean, I guess at least for me, Jai, I don't know how much your theater background enters into what you wrote, but I had to do a lot of fantasizing and taking liberties, because whenever I auditioned for the play, I always assumed I would not be cast. So in order to put myself into the role of someone who thought he would be cast was a stretch of some sort.
Well, okay. I understand that too. That's another perspective. Jai, tell me a little bit more about what your book is about.
Sure. And I just want to acknowledge the resonance that Adam called out earlier, and I didn't recognize until he mentioned it, about Anne Frank's diary being written in June of 1942. I, loved your book, Adam, but I didn't know that until you mentioned it in this moment. So, it's similar to Cyclorama. My novel, at least in its front story, is about the echoes of art. In this case, the post office as it was performed in 1942. But then 30 years later, a fictionalized survivor from Janusz Korczak's orphanage by the name of Jarek, is invited to India to perform that play again in a very different set of circumstances. So the book explores who Jarek is 30 years later, after having been part of Janusz Korczak's performance, how he exists as an adult, as someone who is in a relationship now with a woman from the American South, and how he will react to a set of political crises that are unfolding in India at the time. And so for those who may not be aware, 1971 in India is a fractured moment. So that is when you have the creation of what is now known as Bangladesh, so separating off from the country of Pakistan. And according to the government of Bangladesh, you have 3 million people who lose their life during that crisis, which would make it the largest genocide since the Holocaust. So he is in a difficult moment, and that play it leads to encounters with villagers in India, and also to his past.
And Jai, I'm just curious before, I don't want to, how did your research process work for this? Where did you, you're writing about, you're also writing about New York at a time from the past as well. And I'm curious what your research process was, whether stuff was from memories of people you knew, whether it was from the library. How did you place yourself in these locations?
I mean, the book took 10 years to write, and I would say a lot of it was just researching. But I definitely want to hear about your process too, Adam, because I feel like I got a window into Americana, into a really vital part of American history. But for me, it was a few things. One, I got to work with a scholar of the Warsaw Ghetto, and ended up traveling to Poland and working with Janusz Korczak scholars on that Polish history. And then I spent time in Shantiniketan, India, which is where part of the novel, the Indian part of the novel, is set. And then as I was getting ready to start sharing the novel, I realized I did not know anything about New York in the 1970s. And I had to go back and do some archival work. And that was actually super fun to be able to walk the streets and kind of imagine myself a few decades before in New York.
By coincidence, another strand that binds all of us, it binds you too, Jai. I noticed that some of the research you did was from this book called Who Shall Write Our History, and that book was written by Sam Kassow, who happens to be from Hartford. So we're all intertwined on some level. But Adam, I wanted to know, tell us a little bit about your book. Tell us about the storyline.
The storyline is, as I described a bit earlier, it's about a production of the Diary of Anne Frank that takes place in 1982, and it is led by a very dictatorial and abusive high school director who has been unsuccessful in his creative life outside of the high school, and uses these high school students as kind of an outlet for his frustrations and abusive fantasies, which has repercussions that wind up affecting these kids well into the future. So even in the late, no, not late, we're not in the late 21st century yet, even in the early 21st century, the reverberations of the abuses and the trauma people experienced under his direction still has an effect and changes the trajectories of their lives. I don't want to get into necessarily, unless you ask me specific questions, what exactly the abuse entails, what the exact experience of trauma is, but I am interested in how the experience of being in one show, and particularly this show, particularly the Diary of Anne Frank, which there's, you can be in, other shows I did when I was in high school, that like Guys and Dolls, and probably Guys and Dolls, unless you had an abusive director, would probably not be a traumatic experience. But when you're living out the lives of the characters in the Diary of Anne Frank, living out that script night after night, day after day, I kind of thought that would be different, and that would have a different sort of impact, one that would resonate, and one that would kind of inspire or lead the characters to pursue lives they wouldn't have otherwise had they not been in this play, or had they not been in this sort of production.
I think you're probably right. I recall being in the production. I never saw another butterfly, and also Holocaust production, and there were reverberations. People had a hard time with that, but here we are to talk about it. So we're moving forward. You talked about the characters in your book, and they're very well defined. Each character, you had 10 characters in the Diary of Anne Frank, and they're extremely well defined. And I know from experience, whenever I speak to an author and I ask him, do you identify with any of the characters? And when I was reading your book, I felt that you I felt that you were one of the characters, to be accurate, Frank Light or Franklin Lichtenstein. That was my thought. But my question to you is, because I'm not going to ask that question because all the authors tell me no. So I'm going to ask, are there parts of you in some of the characters?
Yeah, I mean, there are parts of, and I'm Jai, you can speak to this too. At least from my perspective, there are parts of me in every character there is. There are two things I would say about that. One of which is, there's a show on Broadway now, The Piano Lesson, by August Wilson. And when August Wilson was alive, I interviewed him and I asked him the same question that you're asking me, and I said, "Which character is you?" And he says, "They're all parts of me." And I think that's true. And the other thing I would say is, one experience that I had that was kind of a formative experience, even though it seems trivial, was when I was 11 or 12, I watched a show on PBS, and it was a show about holograms. And I was really sort of taken with the idea of a hologram and this art that could be three-dimensional. And so I was watching this documentary on PBS, and there was a scene where a guy has a hologram and he smashes it to the ground, and it smashes into 1,000 pieces. And for a moment you think it's broken, everything is ruined, but then he picks up each individual piece and says you can see the whole through each of these individual pieces. And I feel kind of when I'm writing each character, what I'm doing is I'm kind of taking the hologram of my life and smashing it, but from each character, each perspective, you can kind of see a glimpse a little bit of the whole. Jai,
Right.
how do you deal with the, is this autobiographical, which one of these is you sort of question?
Well,
You're
I
probably
have to,
not Lucy, I would say.
I'm not Lucy, but I have to admit, I have to say, Jai, that when I was reading it, I thought I identified you with Yannick, who is the protagonist of the whole book. But so I'm going to ask the same question. I'm going to pose the same question, not which character do you relate to, but do you see elements of yourself in all the characters, and which one more than another?
Yeah, I think unless you're writing satire, I think it's very difficult to pull off character-driven fiction if you don't identify closely with your characters. And I'm thinking about, in this moment, Luis Alberto Urrea, who was actually writing a book of nonfiction, and it's called The Devil's Highway. And he originally had a perspective about border agents, people who were patrolling the border. He had a conception about who they would be, how they would exist, what their opinions were. And so once he actually spent a lot of time with them, all of those conceptions started to become more complicated. And so that process of deeper complication and identification, I think, allowed him to write that book. So I don't think I don't know any writers who are able to pull off character-driven fiction without that sense of empathy and that sense of complication. For me, the process that's been really vital has been to have character journals, which actually kind of harks a little bit back to method acting, and something that's mentioned in Adam's book, where I will actually write in the voice of my characters. Even though this book is primarily in the third person point of view, I will ask my characters questions and just try to find out who they are in the first person. And so that's a way that I can get close to Yarrick, the protagonist, or to Lucy, who is his lover. But I think it's essential to have that empathy if you're going to give your characters a fair shake.
You just
Jai,
brought up,
I'm sorry.
sorry, you
I was
just,
going to say, Jai, do you have any acting background beyond your childhood performance in the post office? Did you pursue it any further?
I mean, I pursued it very mediocrely throughout my life. I think I was terrible at it. But yeah, I did continue to pursue it. I guess before I started the whole writing gig.
you mentioned, as you were speaking, Jai, you mentioned about the love. The theme of love is a very big theme in your book. The love affair with Lucy, who is from the South, completely from a different culture. You're a Yarrick is a Holocaust survivor. Lucy is from the Deep South. She comes from a completely different way of life with a completely different set of trauma. Was that love affair? You know, you said you were with your partner in Israel, and was that love affair somehow mirrored your love affair? Could we go there?
I think that is, it's possible to go there. I think it would require a degree of psychoanalysis that I'm likely incapable of. But I'm sure there's ways in which the relationship that I have with my partner goes into how I think about the relationship between Yarrick and Lucy, which is the seminal relationship in this novel. At the same time, I think the privilege of fiction is that you get to imagine other realities, other ways, in this case, of falling in love. And you get to take everything you've ever observed as well and integrate that. So I think that, yes, and also it's a composite of all of my other experiences and observations about how people fall in love. And New York City is one of these incredible places where people of different backgrounds, a woman from the American South in 1972 could conceivably meet a survivor of Janusz Korczak's orphanage in a listening room, listening to classical music, and decide that they are beschert.
Oh, very good, beschert. So I'm seeing, like, we're talking about themes running through this book, and I see a parallel between the two novels. I think Adam wrote this, how the traumas of our youth echo through our lives, in the partners we choose, the politics, the careers, how the stories of our past haunt the stories of our present. I think that's a line from you, Adam, also. Adam, talk a little bit about the concept of memory.
I think that line may have been written by a publicist, though it actually is eloquent and sums up the novel nicely.
I think so too.
But
I think so
I'm not
too.
sure if I took credit that, or maybe I ghost wrote that for the publicist. I'm not sure. But I mean, everything, or at least everything in this novel, is imbued with the kind of, I think it was Salvador Dali who had a paint, or Rene Magritte had a painting that was called The Persistence of Memory. And it's, it looms very large in the lives of each of these characters. And I think, I don't know, I'm just kind of spitballing this as I go. I think memory, the kind of the way it forms, has changed a little bit in our generation in terms of social media, where the past is no longer so past and the present is imbued with the past. So you can be talking to people who you knew 40 years ago, but there's COVID and there's Zoom, and at the same time, it's like their past selves and their present selves are kind of all there at once. And that's very much how it is for these characters in the novel. They're living in 2017, they're adults, they're living these jobs, but at the same time, they have this experience that they had when they were kids, and it's very, very present and persistent.
That's what I'm hearing. That's what I'm hearing completely. I want to tell both of you that this program is co-sponsored by Voices of Hope, whose mission it is to fight bigotry and hatred through genocide and Holocaust remembrance and education. And much of our talk in Voices of Hope is how trauma, even though you haven't experienced the trauma, how it's experienced by the second generation experiences the trauma, even though they never went through it. Does that make sense? Sort of.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So Jai, as you mentioned, your book starts in 1942, but it ends in 1972 during the Naxalite Revolution, and also concurrently with West Pakistan becoming Bangladesh, and with scores of Hindus leaving and settling in India. in Bengal. And you come from Bengal, am I right?
I do. So my maternal grandparents come from what is now Bangladesh, and my paternal grandparents were in Calcutta already for a few generations. So my maternal grandparents were refugees. They were landowners in Bangladesh. They fled from religious persecution with very little other than as the cliched saying goes, the clothes on their back.
So do you think in this novel that you chose that specific area? You could have chosen another conflict. You didn't have to choose that particular one. But do you think you chose it because there was something about you reliving this trauma? I don't want to get too psychological, but do you think that was a choice? You made that choice for that reason on some level?
I'll have to consult my therapist for the definitive answer on that one, but it's possible. I mean, so the epigraph of the novel says, "To anyone who's crossed a border in search of home." And when I wrote that epigraph, I was thinking about Zosha, who is my partner's grandmother and a survivor of Auschwitz. And I was also thinking about my maternal grandparents as well, as I just mentioned, who left Maimanshing in Bangladesh and crossed over to Kolkata. But I think it's not just a story about those individuals. I think it's a story that sadly is repeated over and over again in the world. And this has become a key part of our narrative of migration. Adam, I wonder if I could ask you a question that's been on my mind.
Is it going to require my therapist, since a lot of that's involved that for you as well? Or
Well, we'll see. I don't think so. But so one of the things that I think you do so well in your book is going back to this word reverberations. So there is this trauma of the play and how each of the kids responds to that, and yet their front story decades later doesn't feel purely determined by that trauma. And Charlie Baxter has talked about how fiction that's overdetermined by trauma of the past can start to feel like it's slogging through memory alone rather than sort of like having a full present moment. So I'm curious, like, how you balanced this idea of the reverberations of the past with constructing a full and rich front story.
I mean, that's a really good question. And I like that quote from Charlie Baxter that you just indicated. I think, I was trying to be true to the experience that these characters would have had. And, it's this traumatic experience in the past, it is going to have kind of strong and weaker effects on each one of the characters. It can't affect all of them in the same way, much as 10 people having the same experience are not going to have the same reaction. It's not going to have the same impact. For some, it's like kind of the moment they never got beyond. For some, it's something in the past that they would prefer to forget. For some, it's something they think about from time to time. I really just tried to get into the minds of the characters and see how or if they would be affected at all. So I don't think I was trying not to over-determine or under-determine it. I was just trying to imagine the lives of these characters and picture, you were in the show, it had this effect back then, what does that mean now? And it's the same thing like I have with friends of mine who I was with theater with in high school, back at around the time when this novel is taking place. I can remember something really, really intensely. Someone who was right there sitting next to me can say, wow, what are you talking about? I don't even remember that. Other people can say, yeah, and they would remember it a little bit differently. So if you're being true to the characters and the experience, then they're not going to all react to it in the same way. But I take an approach that's, I didn't have much more success as a thespian than you did. I think I may have dabbled in it a little bit longer than you. I'm not really sure, but I kind of take an improvisational approach, which is something near and dear to Pat's heart, and try and imagine, like, you're in a room, this is the situation, go come up with a scenario. So that's kind of what I was doing for each of these characters, is improvising my way to some semblance of what may or may not be truth.
So you set the second part of the novel, Adam. You set it in 2015, 2016, which is the era of the hashtag Me Too and the Trump and the beginning of the Trump era. And did you start with that in mind? Did you start with the concept that that's where you wanted to end? Because it's very particular.
I knew I wanted to explore characters over a long period of time. I knew that. I knew I wanted to do a show with a play. And the idea of taking a bunch of characters and showing them in one generation, and showing them, it's fairly common in theater to do that, to have Act 1 takes place 1937, Act 2 you put on some gray hair, you put on like different kind of music, and you're 50 years later. I don't see it done in film particularly, but even novels sometimes, you kind of sometimes see a progression over time, but you kind of don't see that here they are as kids, here as they are as adults decades later. I knew I wanted to do that. And I think that I mean, the novel takes place in 2017, 2018, and I think I wanted to see how we got to where we were. And when Me Too broke, when the Trump era began, I think there were a lot of us in Facebook groups who would sit around and say, wait a second, these people who are making the decisions that are affecting our country, this was the kid sitting in class next to us. This was the kid who was in our political science class. Like I would, I would be on watching television and seeing someone defending, anti-immigration or waterboarding policy, and that would be literally someone I had been in class with. And you kind of think, how did that person turn in from that kid who you were in a show with to this person who's writing speeches for the president? How did that happen? And so I think that's how the idea of the generation in which it took place started to formulate. Just seeing who the kids that who you grew up with, and kind of seeing who they become, and trying to figure out what happened along the line to turn that kid into that adult, to turn that rehearsal into that performance.
Yeah, I'm hearing, as I'm listening to you, what I'm hearing is the Brett Kavanaugh issue, that looms loud in my mind. But I wish we could continue, but we seem to be starting to grow out of time. And I just want to tell you as a final note, Adam, I see your novel as a play. I really see it firmly as a play. Putnam County Spelling Bee, chorus line. I mean, I just see it so clearly. And Jai, I see your novel as a movie. I see it as a movie. It's so, the language is so different, the different locations, Warsaw, India, New York. So before we sign off, I want to ask one more question, and then we're going to go to the Q&A. Jai, what's in for the future? What's the next project?
So in February, I have another book coming out, A Small Sacrifice for an Enormous Happiness. So I have been putting my attention toward gearing up for the launch of that book. And I'm also working on another novel as well.
Okay. And now what about Adam? What's for the future for Adam?
Two things. There is a novel that I'm almost done with, but I won't talk about that because there's something that's happening in the very immediate future, which is about 24 hours from now. When I finished the novel Cyclorama about these kids who were performing Anne Frank, I went back to see what the true story was, what happened to the people who were in the original Broadway production, the national touring production, and the film of The Diary of Anne Frank in the late 50s and late 1950s. And so I am doing a 7-episode podcast. The trailer drops tomorrow, called Playing Anne Frank, which talks to the people who were involved in the original production and their families, to see what the real impact of being in Anne Frank was. You can find it on the Forward's website tonight, forward.com tomorrow, and the first episode will drop in a couple weeks.
Wow. Okay. So I want to thank you both, Rayton. I want to thank you both. I want to thank Voices of Hope and also the Mandell JCC, specifically our co-chair people, Kathy Fishman, Alana McGilpin. Alana McGilpin will be managing the Q&A for this project. Special thanks also to David Jacobs of the Mandell JCC. And thank you both. I started this conversation by saying that I feel a lot of gray matter in the room, and I still feel a lot of gray matter, but we're going to switch to the Q. Pardon? Sorry.
That's reassuring.
Yes, it's very reassuring for everybody in the room. Alana, it's your show.
Hi there, thank you. I apologize. I was trying to paste links into the chat, but the link for Jai's book is incorrect. So we will send an email to everybody with the correct links for both books. Also just trying to see, I didn't see anyone sending me a chat question, but I'm happy to take any now. If anyone has a question for Jai, for Adam, or Pat. Or just let us know.
Well, you know what? I do have another question, one more question that I didn't ask, and I wanted to ask about directions. Did the book surprise you in any sort of way, both you and Jai and Adam, that it went in directions that you didn't expect? Did something like that happen?
Yeah, I can start. So at least for the first draft of a story, a novel, I'm not somebody who knows what's going to happen, so I don't put together an outline. Rather, like E.L. Doctorow talked about, I am writing it to the fog with a very vague sense of where my next pit stop is, and then after that, we'll figure it out based on really what I think about as attending to the character and what they are suggesting to me based on kind of listening to the story in that moment.
So no directional shifts that you can,
well, so what I'm trying to say is, because it's that kind of process, everything is a directional shift.
Okay.
Everything is a form of discovery. That's the fun and joy of writing in this way. The downside of writing in this way is that, you can write a first draft and realize that none of it works at all, and you don't have an outline to fall back into, and you have to completely do it over again. But when you don't have an outline, everything you're writing is, I think, a possible discovery.
Wow. And what about Adam? Did you have directional shifts? It started to go in a place that you didn't think it would?
Well, but based on what Jai was saying, I just wanted to indulge in a brief moment of psychotherapy, because Jai mentioned the author of E.L. Doctorow, who is responsible for one of the strangest and most prophetic dreams I ever had, which was I was out of college. I went back home to Chicago. I was living with my parents. I wasn't really enjoying that. I went to sleep and I dreamt that I was being kept prisoner by E.L. Doctorow.
Whoa.
And I was like, what does that mean? And then I woke up and realized my mother's initials were E.L. My father was a doctor. I got to get out of here. So I had to escape E.L. Doctorow. As far as the direction of the novel, I don't outline either, like Jai, because I kind of think that spoils a little bit of the fun. I want to be going towards someplace. I want to have a destination in mind, and I want to be wrong. I want to think I know where it ends up, and I want to go in a completely different direction, which is kind of like how I like being in cities. Like, you have a destination in mind, but the fun is kind of getting sidetracked along the way and taking side streets and shortcuts and discovering things you wouldn't have otherwise.
So were you wrong?
You don't end up in the same place.
Were you wrong? Were you wrong a few times?
Always
Did you
wrong. Oh, you want to be wrong. That's the idea. You don't want to be right. If you're right, it's boring. You want to.
So you were wrong a bunch of times.
You don't have to keep harping on that.
Okay. I have now I have a couple questions. People felt a little more free now. Okay. Okay, this is from Ellen. Jai, I was fascinated with the images of Tagore and the doctor. and their resonance in the face of horrifying but changing circumstances over the years. Could you comment on the impact of Tagore in particular?
Sure. So Rabindranath Tagore, I mentioned he was the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, but he was involved politically in a number of ways. So not only was he a writer, as well as being somebody who was read broadly in India, he moved Bengali from this classical period of Bengali literature toward Bengali literature that also embraced some of the styles of European literature. So he did a lot there, but at the same time, he was deeply involved in a lot of political movements. For example, he was involved in women's causes and women's issues, and he was a friend of Mahatma Gandhi. And the two of them had very differing views on what the future India should look like. Tagore had much more of a pragmatic view that I think, we'll recognize more today, whereas Gandhi was a bit more idealistic. But the two of them were always in dialogue. And if you're looking for some more gray matter in your life, you can check out the conversations between Tagore and Einstein. They had a few discussions over the course of their lives. And because they were such cool people, there were people there to actually record their conversations, and they're worth reading.
Nice. Okay, and this is another question. This is a question from Sharon. Who, for both authors, who is your audience / readership? Adults, teens, or both?
I'll just go first, just give Jai time to think about that one. I think that over the years, we've seen a lot more segmenting in audiences. Like when I was growing up, like there wasn't like YA and middle grade and this part of the library and that part of the library. I kind of read omnivorously from all parts of the library. And so I want to, I'm writing, this is kind of an odd book in that in some way, if I had only written the first half of it, you would file it in the YA section. And if you read the second half, you'd file it in the adult section. So, I guess my father used to have a cartoon clip, clipped out of the New Yorker, I think it was, and it said something like "fun for young and old alike," and there were a bunch of middle-aged people walking out of the theater looking depressed. And I try and write I write kind of the world how I see it, people how I see them, and I don't worry so much about who will read it or where it'll be shelved. But I like the idea of writing a book that is one person's favorite book. I don't know who that person is, but if I wrote a book that was one person's favorite book, then I kind of, that's enough.
Yeah, I am totally with you there, Adam. I think that these demarcations between YA and adult literature don't resonate with my own experience. As a teenager, I was reading everything I could find, from classics to things that were the opposite of classics. I hope that people are still doing that today. I know that they are in many ways. But I did have an idea for who my reader might be. So, like, for example, there were some folks that I had in my head that I was like, oh, I might be writing this book for these people.
Nice. I have a question, just because this is kind of like the world that we live in, is how have your other Jewish Book Council events been? Have you been paired with other people? Have you done just single events? And how have you liked doing it together tonight? Because I know you liked it.
Jai, I think you've done more for this book than I've done for mine so far. I've got more coming up in the spring and the summer. I think this has been a pleasure, and talking back and forth with Jai. The only thing I regret is that we're not in person, but, you know, perhaps we got more people to come that way. Jai, how have your events been?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real treat for me. Most of the time, it's me and a moderator. So it's just a real privilege not only to have Pat and but to have another author to talk with and to learn about a little bit more about your process and how you approach the book. So I really appreciated that.
That's great. Well, I wish you all the best in all your upcoming events. It's been a real pleasure. I'm sure everybody here has enjoyed themselves immensely. And yeah, it is interesting. And like the post-COVID, still going on COVID world, always deciding between in-person, on Zoom, who's in their slippers, you know, who wants to get dressed up. There's, I think, benefits for everybody, but as long as we can still, you know, share and connect in one form or another, it's always worth it. So I really want to thank you. Thank you both for your time, and thank you so much, Pat, for all of your preparation and really helping to elevate this event. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming, and thanks for moderating, and thanks for hosting the event. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Kathy?
So I just wanted to say a few words. My name is Kathy Fishman, and I'm the Executive Director of Voices of Hope and one of the chairs of the book festival, along with Alana. So I also want to thank Jai and Adam for their time and insights tonight, and Pat for moderating, and also the Jewish Book Council, who helped us put all of our 2022 and 2023 programs together. And I want to thank you for attending, all the audience for attending and being with us tonight. If you haven't had a chance to read either of the books, follow the link in the chat. And I apologize for the wrong link earlier. And just a few upcoming events we wanted to mention. There's a lovely exhibit, Sidonia's Thread, at the Mandell JCC right now. We had an open house yesterday, and it will be there through February 10th. Voices of Hope is hosting our International Holocaust Remembrance Day on January 29th at the Emmanuel Synagogue at 12:30. And our next speaker series book festival event is Cocoa at the Ritz, and that's going to be on February 8th. And lastly, if you have any interest in learning a little more about Poland and Israel, please don't hesitate to join us on our March of the Living trip, which is going to be in April. You can see more information about that on the Voices of Hope website. So please be sure to follow Voices of Hope and the JCC on social media, and check out our websites to learn more about our upcoming events and/or to donate. So thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you at the next event.